Parliament's approval of the Public Service Amendment Bill has been praised as a major step in improving governance and ensuring that the right people are appointed to the positions. Now, the proposed law seeks to separate political and administrative powers in government. Let's speak now to the New South Institute for Public Service Reform. Its head is Yoliswa Makhasi, who joins us from or via the virtual platform. Ms. Makhasi, good evening to you. Thank you, as always, for your time. This bill has been described as one of the most important governance reforms since 1996. In your mind, what makes this bill so significant, particularly for South Africa's future?
Thank you, Xoli, very much. There's a number of reasons why this bill is so significant. I think the first reason is the fact that the bill separates political roles of ministers or executive authorities from the administrative roles. In 1994, when the ANC-led government took over, both the political and administrative roles were all given to the political executives in national and provincial government through the Public Service Act. And it's been 30 years down the line. And so what we've been working around is really to ensure separation of these roles so the political principals can focus on the what, and the administrative component can focus on the how, which is what guides the philosophy for public service and administration. This is really meant to push in administration from political interference, amongst others, but also to ensure that administration focuses on building the capability to deliver on the mandate that is brought through the participation of politicians in the system. That mandate really has to do with the role of politicians, which is around strategy, around policy, and around their constitutional obligations. I think the other second important issue is that the legislation creates a limitation of political rights for heads of departments and those who are reporting to them. So you will not have a situation where a head of department also serves as an executive member in a political party. So this is also meant to just create that separation between politics and administration and ensure that whilst the political principles focus on politics, the administrative component focuses on administration and pushing the program of government. Yeah. I think the last thing I want to raise in relation to this policy is that if you read the NDP chapter 13, you would see that there is a concern raised about the constrained political administrative interface between ministers or executive authorities and heads of departments. Yeah. So what this policy enables is to create a mechanism to manage or to support those relations in a much more better way by directly delegating the role of head of public administration, somebody who has a responsibility to really look over these relations and support the heads of departments as well when they go through some of the challenges, and also look at career incidents of heads of departments. And that person becomes the head of department in the presidency, the DG in the presidency. Yeah. So all in all, Oli, I think that the policy on its own, the legislation on its own is a great move from where we're coming from. But again, legislation on its own is not going to do much. It requires political and administrative will to ensure that it gets implemented. Where the process is now, I think it's really at the last stages. I was told that it must go back to the National Assembly or to the House for ratification, but it has gone through all the processes in Parliament. And we've heard about 7 provinces out of 9 provinces supporting the policy from the legislation from the NCOP.
I'm glad you've gone the distance to explain, particularly emphasizing the separation between the political office and the administrative arm, and as you put it, political interference being the key issue here. People always understand things better when you put examples, living examples. Right now, we could argue that what is before the Madlanga inquiry and the ad hoc committee is exactly what this bill seeks to resolve, because Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi says there was political interference by Senzo Mchunu, basically interfering in police work by dismantling the political killings task team. I'm just using this as an example. But here is the question. Critics will always worry that reforms on paper will not always shift behavior in practice. Therefore, what are the obstacles that could undermine the operationalization of this bill once it becomes law?
I think some of the obstacles have to do with the fact that there will be resistance to the legislation, even in the process of developing the legislation and taking it through various processes in Parliament. There has been resistance to the legislation. There are executive authorities who do not understand why there must be a separation, why administrative roles must be devolved to the heads of departments, whilst the political principals focus, because they say this is their role as executive authorities because it's in the legislation, forgetting the history of South Africa and where we come from and why in 1994 perhaps there was a decision to take these roles within the political principles, because at that time there was an apartheid government that was not trusted to be able to deliver on the mandate of the new government. And our argument is that 30 years down the line, the situation must have definitely changed. So there is that reality. There's also reality of resources, in the sense that our economy is not performing well and there's really limited resources and many competing needs in South Africa. So from that point of view, resourcing of this legislation is going to be very important. However, we also don't think that you need any much more special funds to be put into this policy, because departments on a day-to-day, their role also includes professionalizing the public service. So it's a matter of looking at how we deal with certain processes and how we change things around.
Yeah.
I think the other issue could be an undermining of this policy by the same people, or this legislation by the same people who are supposed to be implementing it, be it executive authorities or be it from an administration point of view. Those who are benefiting with the current system as it is, from a political interference in particular perspective, may not be happy and may put in place mechanisms to undermine the policy. But this is where the role of other partners outside government and even those within government comes in, to ensure that we support government to implement and also we monitor implementation. So from the New South point of view, we have raised our hands to say that we need to be able to raise our hand to support the implementation. The last thing, I think this legislation is not the beginning and the end. Professionalization of the public service is something that has been talked about, and there's been a lot of interventions since democracy.
Yeah.
But what is important is how we take it forward. There's a number of other things that must be resolved. How heads of departments and senior officials get recruited into the system, how we safeguard that process itself is one of the major activities and responsibilities that we need to think about. There's some ideas in the professionalization framework already, but we need to consolidate those as part of the things. How we handle and support discipline in the public service is one of those particular areas that need. So there's a lot that still needs to be looked at and reviewed, but this legislation will take us a step forward in terms of this reform agenda. With the aim,
can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Should be about improving the lives of South Africans and improving service delivery.
Exactly, and I want us to end on that point of improving the delivery of services to citizens, because that's what this is about. But there's one point that you mentioned, and it is the recruitment of the heads of department. What is your experience? What have you seen? You are a former DG yourself. What is it that you noticed that you could say has been the impediment over the years, particularly as it relates to recruiting the right people into key positions?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a few things that we need to look at, in particular the process of recruiting DGs. What currently happens is that you have a panel of 3 ministers and one head of department, usually from the presidency, who oversee the process from an interview process. And then after that, that information goes to the cabinet via the Department of Public Service and Administration. So the Department of Public Service and Administration does quality control before the submission goes to cabinet. And therefore, the minister would make a recommendation based on the quality control that has been done. But I do think that there's value in opening up the process and allowing South Africans to be able to see what's going on in those interviews, what's going on in the process. So one of the issues that we've been arguing for is open up the process itself, but also, is there a role for an independent entity like the Public Service Commission to come into the process, either as an observer in the panel during discussions, or the process starting with the commission, with the Public Service Commission, in terms of really the first shortlist that needs to be done for candidates that can ultimately go into the next phase? My view is you need a hybrid process that brings in independent players, but also that brings in the executive authority, because ultimately it is the president who appoints at the recommendation of the 3 ministers and the DG who would have attended, who had been part of the panel discussion. So bringing in the Public Service Commission, I think there's an agreement on that, but how do you bring it into the process itself without compromising their role of oversight? Because should anything go wrong in that process of interviews, the person there's a role that the PSC plays in terms of oversight, and will have to handle grievances or complaints that come out of that process. So those are some of the things I think that government needs to look at with a very fine eye. We are also, as NSI, doing our own work as a policy think tank on the side, just to generate a number of proposals around these particular issues.
All right. Final question to you. As you've mentioned earlier, at the end of the day, this is about the citizens of this country. They will want to know how this is going to translate to real change on the ground. And therefore, the last question to you, how will this translate into improvements, and particularly improvements on service delivery? What can South Africans expect once this particular reform takes effect?
I think the first thing for me is really stabilizing the public service, because these constrained relations between the heads of departments and the political principals sometimes bring so much instability in the public service itself, and result in staff being forced to choose whether they choose to be with the DG or they choose to be with the minister, and it puts staff in a very difficult situation. I also do think that what is important is that the role players, the implementers, together with the Department for Monitoring and Evaluation in the Presidents, have to develop measurable indicators, working with the implementing departments, so that we could be able to go back and say, this is what we had set to achieve, and this is how far we're going in terms of that. When I say measurable indicators, I'm also talking about impact, because in government, we have a tendency of just counting numbers and counting things that we have done without looking back at the impact of the changes that are being brought into the system. So there is those opportunities. But as I said, you need political will and you need administrative will to drive reforms, to lead the process, as well as to ensure that there's support from stakeholders and there's resources that are allocated, and to lead a change, a culture change and change management that must be rolled out in the public service as part of implementing such a legislation.
Yoliswa Makhasi, thank you very much for your time and insights. She is a former DG herself. She is now the head of the New South Institute, responsible for public service reform.